Executive Director for New Mexico ASBO, and how do we know what makes up the budget from HB2 and how it's all displayed? And we don't know what's going on, what's above the line, below the line. And about a year ago, I heard a presentation from John Cena that's with us today on making sense of the budget. And we've been after him to come to our conference and do the presentation, but his schedule has not allowed. So we have brought with us today Gwen Perea Ornament and John Cena from the LESC to help us go through this. So with that, we're just going to turn it over to John Cena. John, thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Terry. I think we'll give Gwen a minute just to introduce herself, and she's going to go through a couple of the slides in the presentation, even without her camera, and then I'll take over. Gwen?
Okay, thank you, John. I just will say thank you, Terry and Claire and Jessica. Thank you, everyone in New Mexico ASBO. You are wonderful and amazing partners for us and for the entire state, I think, in terms of all things around education, finance, and budget. So we're privileged to be partners with you and support in any way we are able to. John is really going to lead this training. He's wonderful at this presentation, as Terry has said. All I'd like to do is sort of give you a couple of the objectives that we're hoping to come across with some understanding around 5 big ideas. John's going to share our slide deck. So the first objective we're hoping for is that there's some broad understanding of how the state education budget recommendations are developed. So how do we get to the budget during the session? Like, why do we come away with the budget that we come away with? Because it's actually a pretty interesting process. So that's our first objective. And there's a lot of heads in the pile, right? The second is we hope that there's some understanding about how to actually read what is called the General Appropriation Act, also fondly known as the GAA. It also begins as House Bill 2, and then once it's passed, it's the General Appropriation Act each year. So you can hear it referenced in a couple of different ways. We're going to call it General Appropriation Act. As it's passed, that's what it's known as. And there is an intricate process for how to read that. The third thing that we're going to hope for is that there's some understanding around the connection between this act, or the GAA, and what we call the budget high level. Because as we're drafting budget recommendations and our partners are drafting budget recommendations, we don't do so in language or in text. That's how you see it in the actual act. We do it on a spreadsheet. And John's going to take you through this spreadsheet that's called the high level. The fourth thing we're hoping for is that you understand the development then of the unit value that actually is the result of all of this work, that ending unit value per student, or per unit, I should say. And then last but not least, we're hoping that you have some better understanding about the impacts of legislative appropriations, so what occurs or as a result of the legislature on the legislative session, and on appropriation on individual school districts and charter school funding. So what's that connection that happens in a broad sense to you? So with those 5 objectives, and I apologize for my video issues this afternoon, but I'm going to turn it over to John. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. All right. Actually, before I get started, I'm gonna if you haven't already noticed, Gwen and I were both teachers, and so I think we sort of treat presentations like this as if we were trying to teach a class a little bit here. So that's hence the objectives. I'm also going to put in the chat a few different links that might be helpful as we go through the presentation. So the first one I'm gonna give you is a link to the legislative website. If you haven't already been there, I know a lot of you probably keep track of this stuff as we go through the session. but I'm going to put it up there anyway, just in case. In case Terry, it's looking like I'm talking to hosts and panels. Is that getting out to the main group as well?
Yes, you are, John.
Okay,
We have 65 people.
great.
You can't see them, but we have 65 people, and that's because of the licensing for the software.
Sure, sure. I just want to make sure that when I put the links in that they're seeing this. All right. The other link I'm going to put in here is a link directly to the Legislative Education Study Committee's website.
John, I hate to interject, but when you send the links, you have to send it to everyone. I can also copy them to everyone.
For some reason, that's not an option for.
No problem. We'll make sure to share them.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And then let's see, make sure. And then the last link I'm going to put in here is a link to the actual budget itself, the House Bill 2 amendment, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. Okay, so you should have all the documents that you need to sort of follow along if you feel inclined to do so. And I'm going to talk a little bit first about how we build the discussions that go into building the actual budget itself before we get to this session, right? Real quickly, the Legislative Education Study Committee, for those of you who don't know, is an interim committee of the legislature. So it's made up of senators and representatives, Republicans and Democrats. And this committee travels around the state during the interim, the time between legislative sessions, to hear from communities, to hear from stakeholders, as well as staff and education experts, both within the state and nationally, to talk about important education issues and to inform those budget and policy proposals that will eventually be brought to the legislature before the session or during the session. So the Finance Committee also does that. The Finance Committee also meets around the state. The big difference is the Finance Committee is responsible for developing the budget for the entire state. Education is a large portion of that, obviously, but it includes healthcare, childcare, CYFD, everything else that the state operates. The Finance Committee discusses all of those issues during the interim and brings its own set of proposals to the legislature. While all of that is happening, the Public Education Department, obviously based on its own priorities and initiatives, develops its own budget proposal. So they are statutorily required to submit what's called the Public School Support Request by November 31st of each year. And so usually they have to submit that to the Department of Finance and Administration and to the Legislative Finance Committee so that those bodies can take a look at what the Public Education Department thinks is its priorities. We as LESC staff also present budget recommendations to our committee in November and December of each year. And again, those recommendations really come out of the work that the staff does in presenting research, stakeholder engagement, what the committee hears from communities and education stakeholders throughout the interim, right? So I'm going to show you the high level in a few minutes. And it's important to recognize that those numbers are not developed in any sort of isolation. It's based on the conversations that we're hearing from education folks, again, across the state, and then the committee making those recommendations. Of course, every state agency submits a budget to the Finance Committee. But what happens is all of those agency requests end up in sort of consolidated form in what's called the executive recommendation. And so that's the governor's budget. You probably heard of that, or you've probably seen that through the years. That's the consolidation of every state agency's budget gets put into the executive recommendation. And that executive recommendation essentially supersedes all the individual agency recommendations. So for instance, I want to say, I can't remember what the number was, but sometimes the PED will come with a request for a 6% raise for teachers, right? then the executive, in balancing the entire state budget, might actually say, well, no, we're actually only going to ask for 4%, even though PED thinks we should be asking for more, right? So it's the executive's job to consolidate all those requests and sort of make sure that, that within the context of the entire state budget, everything balances out. So at this point, you've got an LESC recommendation, a PED recommendation that becomes the executive recommendation. And then the last piece that happens is that the finance committee creates its own budget proposal, its own budget recommendation, using all of the information, both from its committee and the interim hearings, and all the other recommendations that have come before that, right? So you'll see various components of the exec rec, and LESC rec, and PED rec as part of that final LFC recommendation. When session finally starts, the House Appropriations and Finance Committee just pulls all of those recommendations and starts the budget process, the legislative budget process from that point. So that's kind of how we get to these budgets. They're not out of thin air. It takes, essentially, we get started creating a budget as soon as the session is done. So as soon as this previous session was done, we started thinking about what does next year's budget look like. So here's a couple of resources, and Terry will have this presentation if you want it. There will be links here. Some of the links that I posted in the chat will also be part of the presentation. And so every year the LESC puts together what's called our post-session review, and it will contain an abbreviated guide to that budget bill that we're going to talk about. We're still working on our post-session review. It'll be done in a few weeks, and we'll present it to our committee during our May meeting. Our May meeting is 15th through the 17th, tentatively scheduled. And so if you've got some free time and you really want to hang out with legislators and legislative staff, you come visit us. The other thing that you may have already got a copy of, I know Terry said he sent this out when we first published it, is our quick guide. And this is the first year we put together a quick guide. What that quick guide does, if you haven't already seen it, is it gives a rundown of all the education-related legislation that passed this past session, as well as the budget, and some of the high-level sort of highlights to those budget appropriations. Okay, so from here on, you might want to refer to, if you've already pulled it up, the budget bill that I put the link to. During the session, and this is you, for those of you who are familiar with this process, you've all heard of House Bill 2. For those of you who are not familiar with the session process, House Bill 2 every year is the budget bill. And so when people refer to House Bill 2, that just means the state budget, right? If you haven't seen it, it's a pretty thick document. You know, I would say it's probably like 1.5 inches thick, hundreds of pages. And again, it includes all state agencies and all for the state. For education, I like to start here on section 4, which are recurring appropriations. And for education, for this year, it starts on page 131. And it includes the PED's operational budget, as well as REC's budgets, and then special appropriations to the department. And these are recurring special appropriations. So these little call-outs that I have here, this is what it looks like to see the language around the public education department's budget. This blue box, went too far. The blue box has the appropriations to each of the specific RECs. And then down here, those are the specific appropriations that go to the department to run department initiatives. And you'll see here there's teacher professional development, the grads program, the National Board Certification Assistance for those of your teachers who have maybe benefited from that scholarship, right? The state pays for advanced placement and international baccalaureate test fees. That's included here. So all of these are part of section 4, and these are recurring appropriations to the public education department and RECs. Section 4, subsection K, is what we call the public school support. And education in a lot of ways is somewhat different than other state agencies or other state appropriations in that we have two big budgets. One is the department budget, which funds the operations of the actual people in that building and the organization, as well as the RECs. But the bulk of education appropriations are made through the public school support portion of the bill, right? And this is essentially the money that flows through the SCG that goes to school districts. Obviously, PED is the flow through for that mechanism through the formula, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But overall, the bulk of it goes to you all. So for this year, this is on page 175 of the budget, subsection K. This is your total amount that is going into the state equalization guarantee, $4.171971.2 billion, right? There's some language here I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. This is the part that is, I think, kind of important for folks who are not used to this. And it's where I try, at least, to make some sense of the language that's in the budget versus what a lot of you might see on these spreadsheets that we call the high level, right? And so if I can, I'm going to stop real fast because I want to show you. I want to show you the quick guide. But specifically, I want to show you the high level so that you can see what the whole document looks like if you've never seen it before. Oh, share. Thanks for your patience while I do this. Can you all see that now, the high level, the quick guide that we put together? I can't see or hear anybody. So Jessica, maybe you can help me. Can you see that high level?
Yes, we can see it. And I also posted a link to this document in the chat too, John.
Thank you. And more than anything, I just want to go straight to the high level so you can see it. I'm going to refer to sections of while we go through the presentation. So this is what it looks like if you haven't seen it. And you'll see various versions of this high level because the Legislative Finance Committee puts one together before session. We put one together before session. This version that you're seeing in front of you is what we put in our quick guide, and it includes all the recommendations that each of these entities made in the lead up to the session. So it starts with obviously a description of what the things are, the FY24 op-bud, and then the next three columns are the recommendations of LESC, LFC, and the executive. The last column, the FY25 op-bud, is where the legislature actually finished, right? This is what the budget bill looks like. And so I'll talk a little bit more above the line, below the line in just a second, but this is the high level spreadsheet. You'll see, again, various iterations of this. And at the end of the session, sometimes you may just see one that says FY24 op-bud, FY25 op-bud, without all the recommendations in between. But this kind of helps you to see, well, what did each of these organizations recommend? And then where did the legislature actually end up at the end of the session? So I just wanted to show that. And again, you won't be able to see this whole thing as we go through the presentation. So I wanted you to see the full sheet before we went. And if we have some questions about this, I can always pull this up a little bit later. Give me 1 second. We were talking before we got started. Some of us have forgotten how to use Zoom presentations as well as we used to be able to. And I'm probably one of those people. Okay, so you'll see that this is sort of a little snapshot, thumbnail of what was in the high level. So on the left-hand side of this screen is the language from the public school support, and what we just saw is as the language. What happens is in the spreadsheet there are sometimes these matching pieces. So this number from the budget should match this number on the high level, which indicates the total SCG appropriation. Right. So there is some connection between that language and the high level. What you're going to see here is this is a continuation of the language in the public school support. And sometimes there's language in here that indicates what new appropriations have been made. So here's one example, right? So the language says the general fund appropriation to the state equalization guarantee includes $94,154,400. And there is a corresponding number in the high level that matches that number, right? That is usually reserved for new appropriations. This is to indicate that this is new money and specific use for school districts to fund those 3% salary increase, right? So that exists there. There is also, this is a tricky one because you'll see on the high level spreadsheet that it says $30 million. But in the language, it says the general fund appropriation includes $59 million to meet teacher mentorship requirements, create an educational plan, provide scientifically based literacy programs, and provide career technical ed and implement the community school framework. This is a tricky one because that $59 million actually signifies the $30 million that ended in the budget for this school year, but it also includes previous appropriations that were made to the SEG in past years. So even though you all know that this is a discretionary fund, you can spend this money pretty much however you want as long as you're following the laws. The budget does include language, and the legislature has made appropriations for specific purposes. So there have been past appropriations that said $8 million for early literacy, $10 million for to implement the mentorship law, right? This $59 million encapsulates all of that. Now, there's one other piece that I wanted to talk about on this sheet that sometimes happens is, and this is this red circle that I've got. It says that there's $55 million for school districts and charter schools to purchase culturally and linguistically appropriate instructional materials. This is money that is already in the base. There is no number on this spreadsheet that says $55 million because these appropriations have been made in previous years and have been captured in this top line of the previous year's output, right? There is no addition of that 55 million because it's already in there. And you may hear that term kind of, people sort of joke, it's like that spaghetti sauce commercial where people say like, oh, it's in there. A lot of this stuff is in the base budget that you've been appropriated year over year, but the legislature continues to include this language sort of as a reminder and a signal that you got some money to do these things if you're interested in doing them, right? Even though it's not on the spreadsheet itself. Okay, this is sort of more, I won't say logistical. It's sort of pro forma language that is included in the General Appropriation Act every year. So every year, the Public Education Department, DFA, and LFC folks get together and they put together these what are called performance measures. And so at the end of the public school support section in the budget, you're going to find these performance measures. The LFC actually uses these performance measures when they report back, LFC staff, I should say, uses these performance measures to report out how agencies are doing to the committee. So they do quarterly agency report cards, and they have these little like green, yellow, and red circles that they say, oh, the department's meeting this performance measure, or it's kind of meeting, that's the yellow, or it's not meeting its targets, right? These are reset every year, although they're pretty standard and have mostly to do with student proficiency, along with how districts budget their money and whether or not the department fulfills some of its financial responsibilities in a timely manner. And again, that's for this year, that's on page 178 and probably a little bit on 177. So if you're interested in finding out, well, what are we supposed to be, what does the legislature actually look at? That's one, these are some indicators for that. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about special appropriations, and we'll talk a little bit about where these are above the line below, middle of the line below. But special appropriations are in section 5 of the budget, and there's multiple pages of them. Special appropriations are what we call below the line. We'll talk a little bit about that in the spreadsheet. And these appropriations go directly to PED, but are awarded to schools and school districts and charter schools, usually based on some sort of statutory requirement or some sort of application basis, right? So for instance, the Family Income Index, for those of you who have received money for Family Income Index, there is a law, the Family Income Index Act, that specifies who gets that money and how that money is distributed. So when PED gets the appropriation for Family Income Index, there's no questions about, well, we can just do whatever we want. How do we determine the methodology for distribution? That is already statutorily defined, and it's PED's job to sort of do the implementation of the statute. Right? Community schools also has a statute that says, how you qualify. PED supplements that with an application process where you essentially have to say, right, we want a community school grant. Here's how we meet the requirements of the Community Schools Act, and then you might be selected as a grantee, right? Those are what we call below, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So again, this is special appropriations. There is a section in the spreadsheet, and this comes after the SEG portion, after the categorical pieces that you're used to getting, things like transportation primarily is the big categorical appropriation for you all, and then what we call below the line, which are these non-recurring appropriations that go to the PED. And usually there is some language in the budget, in section 5 of the budget, that says, here's $30 million. There's some language that says for a summer reading intervention program for students. And then there's a number on that spreadsheet that corresponds with that appropriation, right? There's another one for recruitment and retention of educator fellows. Again, the high level says educator fellows. The budget says for the recruitment and retention of educator fellow positions. So if you look through that special appropriations section in section 5, you'll see that the language can be very specific about how to use that, and sometimes it can be pretty broad, right? And then it's honestly left to the discretion of the department to determine how to allocate those funds to either through an RFP or to school districts and charter schools through some sort of statutory or application process. And then the bill usually consists of, there's multiple sections obviously in the budget bill. We've gone through the main ones that have to do with education, but sometimes there are other places. And in this case, I think I forgot to change the language here. I put in a new section of the budget bill. You'll see that there's a couple of different things in section 7, I believe. One of them is a supplemental appropriation to the PED. You all know that there were some issues with the allocation or the appropriation for the free lunches, free meals this year. PED was going to face a shortfall. You all were not going to be able to pay for those meals if the legislature didn't appropriate more money for the current fiscal year, FY24. And so the budget includes this $19.9 million supplemental appropriation that the department can use to pay for things in the current fiscal year. They don't have to wait till the beginning of the next fiscal year to use this money. This will go out to them and to you all so that you can pay for those free meals this school year. Okay, so I'm going to go back very quickly if I can. I'm going a little bit out of order. Gwen is probably wondering, what am I promise it makes sense. And I'm going to share, I'm going to go back to sharing our high level, just very quickly for those of you who still have some questions about below the line, above the line, those kind of things. And again, for those of you who know this, you've probably heard it 1,000 times, but I think it's important because it's such common language that we use, but not everybody understands it. So this is the high level again. And essentially what we're talking about when we talk about above the line, we're talking about everything pretty much above line 30, which is the state equalization guarantee. That's the number that is going to flow out to you August 32, right? Everything above that number is above the line, flows out through the funding formula. We'll talk about that. Below that is the categorical appropriations. Again, primarily transportation is the one that you all probably care about the most. It includes out-of-state tuition, emergency supplemental, the money that the legislature gives the department to pay for state tests, and the Indian Education Fund. All of these are called categorical appropriations. And what that really means is that they can only be used for those specific purposes. You can't take transportation money, as you all know, and spend it on books. You can't take your out-of-state tuition, which you apply for those, I think it's maybe 2 districts, maybe 3 that use out-of-state tuition, and use that on something else. So it's for a specific purpose, they're categorical. Everything below that, either in recurring or non-recurring, sections 5, 6, and 7 are what we call below the line. And they do not factor into the formula. Again, those are programmatic appropriations that support either legislative or department priorities, right? And it's a pretty, we've gotten so used to using these terms, there's no such thing as the middle of a line, but that's what we call categorical appropriations because they sit between that above the line section and the below the line section. So I just wanted to show that one more time in case you're still wondering, what does that mean? I know a lot of you already know that. Okay, I'm going to talk just real briefly about the funding formula itself. And again, most of you know this. For those of you, I think I saw maybe some names that some of you participated or came to our funding formula review that the LESC conducted last interim, and will continue and finalize hopefully this interim. But the funding formula is a distribution method. It does not generate funds, right? The formula itself is just a methodology for dividing up the money that the legislature appropriates. Right? Again, the formula awards funds, if you will, it divides up the appropriation based primarily on students counts, but also on the characteristic of those students and some programmatic units. Right? Again, most of you filled out all your budget documents, you know what this looks like, but it's always important, I think, to remind folks who aren't familiar with the process that the formula itself is a distribution method. It is independent to a certain extent of the money that the legislature actually appropriates to the formula and to schools. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the unit value. And so I'm going to go back to this real fast. Here are all the factors. You know that when you fill out your budget documents, the PED you're generating and the PED is calculating the number of units in the state, right? So obviously, if you've got 100, I hope I don't do bad math here. If you've got 100 students in first grade, you get 120 units for those first graders, right? That was the easiest math I'm not going to do. I'm not going to risk anything else. But all of those units add up, and PED has a number that is the total number of units across the entire state. The budget includes this language that specifies the process for PED to set the unit value. It says that the secretary shall establish a preliminary unit value for next school year. And then on the verification of the number of units statewide, which happens at 40-day, but no later than January 31st, you get your final unit value, right? I also put this in to be a little cheeky, I suppose, that every year the budget includes language that says in setting the preliminary unit value and the final unit value, PED shall consult with DFA, LFC, and LESC. And this is just to show you all that there's always this tension between the legislature and the executive, and that's okay. That's the balance of powers in our democracy. And the governor chose to line item veto out the participation of LFC and LESC in that process as a requirement. The good news is we have pretty good working relationships with folks and are still part of those conversations. When people set those unit values, they share that information. Hopefully we're able to help with that process as well, even though we've been crossed out on paper. So PED takes all of the units that are generated by your students. It takes that giant appropriation, the $4.1 billion in the SCG, and does a very simple division problem. It divides that appropriation by the number of units. That gives you a unit value. Now, of course, there's a little bit of nuance to that, because as we're forecasting for next school year in your budgets, there's this balance between getting as much money out to you on the front end, because that's when you need it overestimating how many units there are, overestimating how many units, because it may mean that we overspend and then we're in the hole. And because of the complications of K-12 plus in the past year, the department actually had to ask for the authority to use some money from the State Support Reserve Fund to backfill and make sure that the unit value stayed the same at the final unit value calculation, so that you all wouldn't take a hit, because it looks like they maybe sent out a little bit more money than they anticipated was going to be needed on the front end, and had to come back and ask for a little bit more. So there's always this balance of getting it out to you, but making sure that it doesn't mean that you have to take a cut in the middle of the year because maybe you've overestimated. And then I just have these examples. These are this is old data. This is not for FY25. Actually, I don't think it's even for FY24, maybe FY23 data. But I only put this up, and this is a presentation, as Terry said, that I gave to our committee last summer. And I mostly wanted them to understand that when you have that unit value, right, that when you get to that final program cost, what the formula is doing in some ways is every district, if you look at this right-hand column, the per mem program cost, you'll see that not every district gets essentially the same amount of money per student. Right? And that's the way the formula is supposed to work. Because if you look at Bernalillo, for instance, the number of particularly bilingual units and at-risk units, right, those add up to an increased the proportion of those units to their overall population is probably higher than if you look at total bilingual program units for Los Alamos and at-risk program units for Los Alamos. They're not generating these categories, and so they're actually receiving less per student per man than some of these other districts out in that formula. And that's the way the formula is supposed to work. It's supposed to generate additional funds or additional units for districts that serve students with maybe some higher needs, and they need the resources to do that. So I wanted to show our committee this so that they understood that portion. I think probably most of you already do know that, but I wanted to put it up there anyway. And with that, I'll stand for questions. I hope this was helpful if you are new to the process, and even if you heard it before, maybe there were some clarifying points, and hopefully I can answer any questions, or Gwen and I can answer any questions that you might have.
John, at this time, we do not have any questions. Let me see if we have some.
As a former teacher, that's always a little scary. That means people either got it or they're really confused and don't even know what question to ask.
So Jessica, if you will help me watch for hands being raised.
Giovanna
Yes.
has a really great question.
I see that. Yeah. You want me to take that one, or you want to take it?
Well, go ahead, John.
I,
I
I'll
can
take. Yeah, sure. So if you, I don't know if the rest of the group can see the questions, but Giovanna, thanks for the question. It says, can you talk to us about the insurance allocation versus NMIMSIA actuals? And this is always really tricky because I'm gonna scroll over to my spreadsheet. I want to say that was I can't remember the total insurance. There we go. So the total allocation for insurance this year was 25,666,000. That's what the legislature appropriated for insurance. We're hearing from the MIMSIA now that, and that's based, I should say this, that's based on a 6% increase year over year, and is something that the legislature has done for the past, I want to say 4 or 5 years that I'm on, because that's been the trend in insurance increases. We're hearing from the MIMSIA this year, obviously you all are hearing this too, that the increases are going to be closer to 15%. And so this was based on those estimates that we've done over the years. And I have to say, in this particular case, we sort of relied on Legislative Finance Committee folks to get us to that number. I will say, as LESC staff, we're working this interim to make sure that we have a better handle on those costs and what those costs, the increases might be for next fiscal year, so you don't find yourself in a position where maybe there's not enough money in the formula specifically for insurance, and you've got to start to pull from other places. But you know, I wish I had a better answer than that, Jamal, but that's what I've got for now.
John, I'm going to add on to that. I do think that it behooves us to take this much more serious than we have in the past, Joanna, as LESC staff. And so we are looking into this. We've already actually started to meet with the MIMSIA. Daniel, our analyst, has done so, looking into sort of why do we have these costs? Initially, we thought it was simply because their reserve had gone down. Looks like there's other issues. We had something about that in our activity report, which if you all are interested in receiving our activity report, which we produce every week, we can ensure that you get on that actual listserv, because we produce one as a staff every week that sort of has little snapshots of what we're studying or looking into. But it was interesting that we found that there was some increase in cost due to uptake of using of prescription drugs, weight loss drugs. But it's an interesting kind of world that we definitely need to look into.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Javon. It really is serious. Laura, you had a question. I see your other question, Javon. I'll come to that in a minute. Laura, you said, I'm assuming when you say they said bilingual programming was not funded, you're talking about PED. I can't speak to what they said, but bilingual programming is funded through the units that you generate through a department approved program. Right? So when you apply to have a bilingual program and the department approves that program, then, and obviously this is based on prior year, you tell the department says, we have to fund this many units in the funded run, and that's the money gets divvied up by those number of units that a district generates for bilingual, right? So it's again, it's sort of the tricky piece of the formula that when we say things like bilingual is not funded, there may not be a specific allocation or appropriation to bilingual education in the high level spreadsheet or in the budget this year, but whatever the appropriation is, it's intended to pay for all the units that are generated, whether that's PE units, fine arts units, bilingual units, at-risk units. Of course, bilingual is a little bit different because you have to file that application with the department. They have to approve your program before you're able to qualify for those units. But once you do, it should be an issue of you get funded for the units that you generate for those programs. And if it's a new program, there's new program units as well that are sort of
John,
right. Yep.
I'm going to add to this. Laura, I think that there's also some sort of mixed messages here, because there's bilingual program units that John is describing that are above the line in the SCG, but there's also been in the past few years about a $5 million or so allocation below the line, as John was describing or showing on the high level, $5 million to support bilingual programming that went directly to the public education department, and they've used it in myriad ways for some, professional development, there was intention last year to use it to revise the assessment for bilingual licensure, which hadn't been expended. So we reallocated, the legislature approved the continuing use of those dollars since it hadn't been fully expended for this year. So that below the line funding was not appropriated once again, but the bilingual programming unit, the bilingual funding in the SCG is still there.
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. Yeah, that was a good catch. Giovanna, your other question about the net changes being negative, and as you say in your question here that this is LFC. So what does happen, as you all know, you're all experiencing, we're seeing decreases in enrollment year over year. We have found that in our analysis, I think LFC is very similar. There's usually about an average 1% decrease in enrollment year over year. Obviously, the pandemic and the years since the pandemic have been a little bit erratic around that pattern, but it still kind of holds that over the last 10 years, there's been about a 1% enrollment decrease every year. So, and this is, if you look at that high level, this is an LFC recommendation that because you're going to have fewer students, they're going to generate fewer units, which means in a very simplistic way, it might cost less to operate schools because you have fewer students. And so LFC takes this credit, if you will, on the formula and says, well, you've got this many fewer students, so we're going to actually take that money out of the formula because we don't think it costs as much. To be honest, we're struggling to understand where the specific numbers come from in LFC's calculation, but we're also working on a methodology ourselves. This is not something we've done in the past because I think the general premise is probably right. Over the course of, we know that year over year, you lose 10 kids in a school district. That may not result in less expenses for you because maybe it's 1 first grader, 1 third grader, 2 sixth graders, but you still need all your teachers, you still need to pay custodians, you still need to pay principals. There's probably not a year over year savings when you see enrollment decreases. Over 5 years, on the other hand, maybe you start to see some fewer expenditures necessary to serve those students when you've really started to see, okay, maybe you only need 1 first grade teacher instead of 2 now in a particular school. And so that's something we're thinking about, Giovanna, in terms of, I think the legislature is going to have to consider what dropping enrollment means, but it shouldn't necessarily be a year over year process when we're not really sure that there's year over year savings when you lose 1% of your students, right? And of course, that's also not distributed equally across districts, right? So somebody may be experiencing an increase in enrollment, maybe a little bit, or staying flat, whereas someone else is experiencing maybe more than 1%. And so because the formula distributes things the way the formula distributes things, that also has disproportionate effects on school districts.
I would just add, Joanna, that what John is saying is very important in terms of it behooves us to have a process that we're looking at or developing within LESC that's an answer to theirs that is unrealistic. We know very much. It's not even a question to me that you should be cut in a year over year basis. That's obviously incorrect. But if we don't figure out another mechanism to recognize dropping enrollment long-term trends, then we're going to continue to see this sort of impact and or approach, I should say, by the Legislative Finance Committee. And so if you have some good thoughts about it, Thought Partnership would be very welcome.
Yeah. The good news is, and I know that this is sort of very small consolation, and I think we're proud at LESC that we were able to advocate for $30 million, sort of no strings attached in the SCG this year that was intended for some innovation at the local level. Because of that net unit changes, it ends up being about 10 million extra rather than 30, but we hope that that provides a little bit of cushion and maybe even a little bit of room for innovation. It's a start. It's something that the legislature hasn't really funded in the past, this sort of bucket of money with no strings attached. And I think we're going to continue to build on that argument because we know that while you've received a lot of additional funds in the past few years, there have been mandates associated with that money, whether it be salary increases or at-risk, funding, that kind of thing. And so for you to have, and districts to have, a little bit of flexibility in how they spend that money is something that we're really thinking about and want to continue to talk about and advocate for. And then Jeannie, you got a question that you understood the legislature capped the premium increases in previous years. That's true. There was language in the budget that said that PED could not approve a school district budget that included insurance increases more than 6%. That language was not included this school year. Any other questions? I don't think I see any others, Terry, but I'm happy to wait for another one or two if there are any.
John, Gwen, thank you guys so much. I'm not seeing any additional questions. And with that, LESC is Legislative Education Study Committee, and these people are our allies, and we appreciate the partnership that we've had with the LESC. I love these guys. They'll always give you direct answers. John, Gwen, thank you guys for being here. We really appreciate your time.